Meet Elizabeth Stuart, the granddaughter of Mary Queen of Scots and the daughter of Anne of Denmark and James VI of Scotland. Elizabeth was born on a beautiful day in August 1596 at Falkland Palace. The little princess spent her happy childhood at Linlithgow Palace and was only 6 years old when her father encouraged her to write letters to him or to her elder brother, Henry Frederick, who was 2 years older than her. In that way, the two siblings would form a close bond. When Elizabeth was 7 years old, her father ascended to the English throne as James I, and shortly after that, the royal children travelled to England. Her education and care was entrusted to John Harrington, who was living with his wife at Combe Abbey in Warwickshire. Elizabeth was taught history in a light and amusing way in order to make her like the subject, and soon the young princess was remarked for her precocious wit and intelligence. The king instructed her teacher to make sure that Elizabeth would fulfill her religious duties and observe the principles of Protestant faith. But music, dancing and painting also played a part in her education. When Elizabeth was separated from Henry, whom she adored, the siblings started writing letters to each other, and very quickly Henry became his sister's childhood idol and friend, who would influence her character. As Protestantism was very important to both of them, they decided never to renounce their faith. In 1605, when Elizabeth was 9 years old, a plot organized by a group of English Roman Catholics against her father was discovered. Quick-thinking Sir Harrington took Elizabeth to Coventry for safety, as the conspirators had planned to assassinate King James and abduct Elizabeth in order to install her on the throne. 3 years later, to her delight, Elizabeth was reunited with Henry in London, where she was allowed to participate at court and experience the royal life and its amusements. When Henry was created Prince of Wales, Elizabeth and her younger brother Charles, Duke of York, who was 10 years old at the time, attended the royal ceremony. Elizabeth, who grew up to become a very beautiful young lady, attracted the attention of many suitors, and from a long list of potential husbands, King James chose Frederick V, Elector Palatine of the Rhine, as the future husband for Elizabeth. Thrilled to be accepted as husband for Elizabeth, the Protestant prince left Heidelberg to travel to meet Elizabeth in England, where he arrived in November 1612. The royal barge passed the Tower of London and reached Whitehall, under the eyes of people cheering the Prince-Elector, who was welcomed by the 12-year-old Prince Charles. Then Frederick was led into the palace to meet his royal bride, who was accompanied by King James and Queen Anne. The 16-year-old Prince Frederick was charmed by the beauty and vivacity of Elizabeth, who was the same age as him. At the beginning, their conversation was done in French, since none of them could speak each other's language, and very quickly Elizabeth was impressed by Frederick, who was well educated and kind. Elizabeth's joy was overshadowed by the fact that her brother, the 18-year-old Prince of Wales, was taken ill. Desperately trying to gain access to his room, Elizabeth was unable to see her brother, who was dying. The last words he was heard saying were asking to see her. Tragically, on the 6th of November 1612, Elizabeth lost her beloved brother, who was mourned by the whole nation. Although it was a difficult time for the royal family to deal with the mourning for Prince Henry and the wedding of their princess at the same time, the marriage between Frederick and Elizabeth received the royal seal of approval and was scheduled to take place as soon as Frederick could speak English. Elizabeth, who made sure Frederick could learn English quickly, was delighted when he received the Order of the Garter, and soon after the ceremony the king announced the formal engagement of his daughter to the German prince. Captivated by her chivalrous prince, Elizabeth was delighted to receive from him a superb tiara, a ring, and many other expensive jewels. Their sumptuous wedding was celebrated in London on the 14th of February 1613, when thousands of people gathered to celebrate the event. In the spring of that year, the happy couple left England, sailing to Holland, where they were welcomed by Maurice, Prince of Orange, who was her husband's eldest uncle on the maternal side. Meanwhile, Frederick travelled to Heidelberg to make sure the castle palace was ready to receive his wife. On her course to the Palatinate, Elizabeth travelled through the Netherlands, and in June the princess reached Heidelberg, where she was warmly received and cheered by the happy crowds and the German nobles. Her entrance was also eagerly awaited by Frederick's mother, Juliana of Orange, who embraced Elizabeth dearly as her own daughter. Frederick, who never tired of making his wife happy, commissioned renowned architects to design a magnificent English-style garden that was built next to the castle of Heidelberg for Elizabeth to enjoy her daily walks. Although their marriage was decided by political interests, they were fortunate to have a loving relationship. Their first child, born in January 1614, was a boy whom they named Henry Frederick in memory of Elizabeth's beloved brother. He was naturalized by the English Parliament and became heir to the English crown. By the time Elizabeth was 22, she had two more children, Charles Louis in 1617 and Elizabeth in 1618. Meanwhile, in Bohemia, the Protestant nobles rose in rebellion against Ferdinand II, who was trying to impose his Roman Catholic religious views by persecuting various Protestant groups. When the king was overthrown, the crown of Bohemia was offered to Frederick V, who was the leader of the League of Protestant Princes. The 30 Years' War had started. Frederick's mother advised her son against accepting the offer. Why would he be sacrificing his principalities for an illusory kingdom? In August 1619, Frederick went to Amberg, close on the border of Bohemia, to meet the Confederate Calvinist princes, who were eager for him to accept the Bohemian crown. From there he wrote to Elizabeth to ask for her opinion, and she replied saying, "Since you are persuaded that the throne to which you are invited is a vocation from God, by whose providence are all things ordained and directed, then assuredly you ought not to shrink from the duty imposed. Nor, if such be your persuasion, shall I repine, whatever consequences may ensue, not even though I should be forced to part from my last jewel, and to suffer actual hardships, shall I ever repent of the election." When Frederick signed the acceptance document, becoming King of Bohemia, he could not have suspected that their lives would take a completely different turn. The couple left the court at Heidelberg after an emotional farewell, going to Prague to assume the throne. Arrived at the border, Frederick issued a proclamation to promise religious freedom and uphold liberal principles. Solemnly welcomed by the citizens of Prague, Frederick and Elizabeth were crowned King and Queen of Bohemia in November 1619. Queen at 23, Elizabeth was elated and looking forward to a promising future. A few weeks later, she gave birth to another son, Prince Rupert. Elizabeth, who kept in touch with her father in writing, was sad to learn that he did not recognize the newly acquired titles of his daughter and son-in-law. King James declared that it would only take a few weeks to show that Elizabeth and Frederick could only rely on a very small minority of Calvinists. In less than a year, their popularity among their subjects started to dwindle, and when the Protestant princes withdrew their support for the King and Queen of Bohemia, their fate was sealed. Meanwhile, an army of Spanish troops seized on the Lower Palatinate and was aiming to capture Heidelberg. Frederick's mother wrote in despair a letter to James I, imploring him to help his two grandchildren she had there under her care. Elizabeth wrote to Charles to ask him to speak to their father to help her husband, but all Charles could do was send her all his savings. Soon the armies of the Catholic forces were approaching Prague, and the princes of the Union abandoned Frederick to his enemies. Ferdinand II was eager to conquer Bohemia and teach the Protestant rebels a lesson. His forces proved superior and inflicted a heavy loss on the Protestant army. In November 1620, a year after he had become King of Bohemia, Frederick lost the Battle of White Mountain and the Catholic League was victorious. Driven out of their kingdom, Elizabeth and Frederick fled Bohemia in a rush. In January 1621, while crossing Europe in search for refuge, Elizabeth gave birth to the couple's fifth child, whom they named Maurice, in remembrance of the friendship of their uncle, Prince Maurice, who offered them his support when all others deserted them. When Frederick lost the Palatinate, which had been occupied by the forces of the Catholic League, the fugitive King and Queen of Bohemia settled in The Hague. Deeply affected by the situation he was in, Frederick was saddened to hear how people scorned him, saying he was a beggar king whose reign lasted only 1 year. To many people, he was just the winter king. Putting aside adversity, Elizabeth offered her husband the support he needed by encouraging him to embrace whatever life offered in The Hague. From queen to pauper, Elizabeth spent her days visited by her English friends and established correspondence with many intellectuals in England. Although James I was unhappy about his daughter's situation, he chose not to act in any way to help her husband recover his kingdom. As James feared that helping them would provoke the King of Spain, he chose to sacrifice Elizabeth rather than relinquish the Infanta of Spain as a possible match for his son Charles. Years rolled on since their arrival at The Hague, and while the couple's stores of wealth decreased, many other children were born in the succeeding years. The couple would have 13 children together. Elizabeth brought up her young children in the same domestic love which had united her so fondly with her own brothers, and encouraged them to write to each other the same kind of innocent little letters. Meanwhile in England, Elizabeth's father died and her brother ascended to the throne as Charles I. Always in need of money, Elizabeth received at the end of 1628 an unexpected gift. Before he died, Maurice of Orange had bequeathed to her his share in a Dutch company that had raised a fleet which captured some plate-laden galleons from Mexico bound for the Spanish Netherlands. In joyful anticipation of receiving Elizabeth's share of the cash, Frederick set out from The Hague to Amsterdam. Their 15-year-old son, Prince Henry Frederick, asked permission to accompany his father to the Sea of Haarlem to see the Spanish galleons. At the beginning of January 1629, Elizabeth was unable to join them, so the father and his son parted from her with smiles. When they approached the object of their research, their yacht was suddenly sunk and buried in the waves. Clinging to a rope, Frederick reached a boat that had been launched to his assistance, but all efforts to save Henry Frederick were unsuccessful, and he drowned in the icy sea. His last words were, "Save me, father, save me." Overwhelmed with grief, Frederick declared that those cries would never leave him, hearing them ring in his ear to the last hour of his life. Although Elizabeth was crushed by the tragedy, she had to be strong and support her husband, who found himself indifferent to life and unable to carry on as before, surrendering the management of his political affairs exclusively to Elizabeth and his secretary. Meanwhile, a new champion for the Protestant cause was about to take the field. He was Gustavus Adolphus, the King of Sweden. On the 14th of January 1632, Elizabeth gave birth to her 13th child, a son whom she named Gustav, after the Swedish champion, and shortly after that Frederick bade her a tender farewell and went forth to the war. The victories of Gustavus Adolphus offered a glimmer of hope to Frederick, who joined the Swedish king and followed the movements of the Swedish forces marching into Bavaria. But soon Gustav of Sweden gave Frederick to understand that if he wanted to be reinstated in his dominions, he had to accept the terms of holding the Palatinate in vassalage to the Swedish king. Frederick rejected the humiliating proposal and decided to part with the Swedish king, planning to go back to The Hague. Sadly, he developed a fever and was taken ill, something which he concealed from Elizabeth. He died on the 29th of November 1632, aged only 36. Anxiously waiting for him to return home, Elizabeth received instead the tragic news. About her unbearable loss she said, "It took away my faculties, although not my sense of misery, and I remained for 3 days frozen and silent, unable to speak or weep." The grief of Elizabeth was also felt by her children, who tried to console their mother. Her brother Charles wrote to her to beg her to go to England as soon as she was able to travel. But Elizabeth replied by saying that she preferred the welfare of her children to her own happiness, wanting to do what would be best for them. From then on, her mission was the restoration of her son, Charles Louis, to the Palatinate. King Charles agreed to pay an annual sum of money for his sister and her children, mainly from his main estates, whilst Elizabeth tried unsuccessfully over many years to reinstate Charles Louis in his father's dominions. During the years of the English Civil War, 2 of her sons, Prince Rupert and Maurice, fought alongside their uncle, King Charles I, in support for the royalist cause, while Elizabeth remained at The Hague with her daughters. After her brother died, the pension from England stopped, and Elizabeth found herself in a difficult situation. But the Peace of Westphalia had brought to a close the 30 Years' War, and 16 years after his father's death, Charles Louis was finally able to regain the Lower Palatinate and the title of Elector Palatine. Elizabeth hoped that her years of hardships and poverty were over. Many years before, Elizabeth had declared that her son Charles Louis was more to her than all her daughters. But she was bitterly disappointed when she realized how little help he was prepared to give her, refusing to receive her in his restored dominions. By 1652, Elizabeth had experienced many more painful events and had only 6 surviving children. In 1658, Elizabeth's youngest daughter, Sophia, married Ernest Augustus of Brunswick-Lüneburg, and 2 years later they had a son, George Louis. That event would reveal its significance some years later. Finding herself almost alone, one day Elizabeth decided that after 40 long years of exile, it was time for her to return to England. But her nephew Charles II, who had been restored to the throne of England, was not enthusiastic about his aunt returning to England, and even tried to delay her departure from Holland. Elizabeth replied to him, saying that she had already taken farewell from her friends and was determined to reach England. Elizabeth, the Queen of Hearts, as she had become known, given all the misfortunes she experienced and the courage she showed in overcoming them, arrived in England in May 1661 and died less than a year later at the age of 65. She was mourned by Prince Rupert, as he was the only one of her children then in England. But the story of Elizabeth Stuart did not quite end then. In 1701, her daughter Sophia became heiress presumptive to the English crown when the Parliament of England passed the Act of Settlement. However, Sophia died 2 months before becoming queen. But in 1714, her son, George Louis, became King of Great Britain as George I. Without a doubt, Elizabeth Stuart would have been proud to witness the event.